Welcome back to Black Indians and Freedmen, the podcast. How are you, Dr. Christina Dickerson Cousin?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. All right, Chapter 6 continues your discussion about the Indian Mission Annual Conference. What did it mean to the IMAC to have Henry McNeil Turner as its bishop? And where does his work in the IMAC rank among his contributions to the AME Church?
Okay, so the IMAC, or Indian Mission Annual Conference, gets established in 1879. Then the next year, 1880, there is a general conference in which Bishop Henry McNeil Turner is appointed over that district, which now includes the IMAC. And for people living in Indian Territory, it was exciting to have Turner appointed their bishop. He, at this point, is already a nationally known figure for his work during the war, the fact that he was a politician during Reconstruction, and of course, that he is now an AME bishop. And if you read letters from the time of AME ministers in Indian Territory talking about their experiences, they would often say that, I went to this group of people and I told them about the AME church, and they just didn't believe that it was possible that we would have Black bishops. And so there was a level of skepticism and disbelief that there could have been an organization that had Black bishops. And so for a bishop to show up at all, let alone Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, this nationally known figure, it was a big deal, and people responded to that. Bishop Turner, as I mentioned, he is already a nationally known figure. He will do, far more in the subsequent decades. And so I think his work in the Indian Mission Annual Conference really helps to underlie his general feeling that the AME Church should be reaching out to people throughout the African diaspora, whether they are in Indian Territory or they are in, on the mother continent of Africa itself or in the Caribbean. And so this is very much a part of that larger vision that he has for the denomination.
Okay. On page 22, you talk about such expenses as delegate travel that the AMAC had to incur. How did the IMAC adjust to its connectional financial obligations, and were the members able to keep up with these obligations?
That's an excellent question. And what generally happened was that members of the IMAC, they were kind of amazed at the financial obligations that they had to meet. Of course, they had already known that, yes, you support your local pastor, but now that they are an official conference, they have to host, annual conference meetings. They have to be able to send delegates to general conference. All of these financial, responsibilities become, really a challenge for people. Keep in mind, these are folks who are not far removed from slavery, who don't have a great deal of income. And so they're initially kind of taken aback by these requirements. And when ministers come to them and say, I need money to make it to conference, they say, well, we don't have it, so I don't know what to tell you. And so we see over time that once they get used to this idea that this is the requirement, they do the best they can to support their ministers, to support whoever needs to go to whatever meeting, whatever annual conference meeting they have to hold. But it does take a sort of a transitional period.
Okay. Well, speaking of money, what is the dollar money system, which you mentioned on page 122, and how did it benefit the denomination's national and international infrastructure?
The way the church was financed in this period was through the dollar money system. Basically, you have, an annual conference, you have your district, and every member of every church was supposed to give $1 per year for the support of the denomination as a whole. And that money would be used to pay salaries of bishops and general officers and help to support the schools, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically, if you're looking at just your local congregation, everyone in your local congregation is expected to pay $1 every year. And so if you think about that and all the churches that the AME Church has in the country, that is the money that the denomination had to work with. And so, of course, some districts have a higher dollar money count than others. Some people are more financially stable than others. The Indian Mission Annual Conference, certainly in those early years, struggles in this dollar money system because, again, the people do not have a great deal of material wealth, but they try their best. Even if they can't give the full dollar, they may give, 10 cents, 20 cents, whatever they have to try to support their conference. And so this dollar money system is really how the church is financing itself. And what's great for the historian is that the annual conference minutes will often publish the
Mm,
dollar money record. So you can
okay.
look at annual conference minutes, as I have done in the Indian Mission Annual Conference, and you'll see the dollar money list, and it will tell you essentially who paid that dollar, which means we know who the members were of all of
Right.
these churches because their names are represented in the dollar money. And so that was invaluable for my research. I was able to look at this dollar money, look at the list of people who paid at which church, and then I could cross reference those names with census records and other kinds of records. And it was really an important source for me in terms of researching this book.
All right. We're going to shift gears a little bit. On pages 123 to 125, you discuss how IMAC members were exposed to AME liturgy and Wesleyan hymnody. So, why was this important, and what role did Bishop Turner play in immersing members of his district in traditional AME customs?
So, one thing about the AME Church is we have our rituals. You know what
Mm-hmm.
you are going to recite, you know what you are going to sing at a district conference, an annual conference, a general
Mm-hmm.
conference. And this is a way of, in a way, standardizing the experience. That yes, there will be regional differences depending on what church you attend. Yes, there will be cultural differences, but fundamentally, we're all going to hear, and are we yet alive? We'll all,
Yep.
be reciting the Decalogue and singing singing "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." And so Bishop Turner really does, go about instituting that in the IMAC. And you see that reflected in annual conference minutes. So the bishop always presides over the annual conference. And so if you look at those minutes, you'll see Turner, leading the congregation in a particular song. And oftentimes these are songs that were written by Charles Wesley, who was a prolific hymn writer. And
Mm-hmm.
so in this way, Turner and others are able to really enforce in an enjoyable way, AME orthodoxy. And for people who may not have, necessarily grown up AME, who may have just joined the church, this is the way to introduce them to what AMEs do, what AMEs believe, what AMEs sing. Because hymns, of course, they contain within them the theology.
Scripture.
And
Yeah.
so you may not be able to, maybe you didn't go to seminary, but you can, listen to these songs, you can repeat these songs and understand the theology that is behind this religion. And so Turner very much believes in that. And so you see in these various meetings him pushing for these hymns and having this hymn sung. And so it was an important experience for the diverse people in Indian Territory. They may have all had, cultural differences and linguistic differences, but when they showed up to conference, they were all singing, the same songs.
Yep. All right. On page 26, you talk about the establishment of the Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Society. Please talk about the founding of the WHFMS, how it came to be established in Indian Territory, and its diverse membership. Please also discuss the amazing work of Emma Tucker, the first president of the WHFMS of the IMAC.
I know that's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
acronyms. So the Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Society was actually the second women's auxiliary founded in the AME Church. So
Mm-hmm.
initially, you have the Women's Parent Mite Missionary Society, which was founded in the 1870s, and it was largely based in the North, and the leadership of that organization tended to be the wives of bishops. So as the AME Church continues to expand in the South and in the West, Bishop Turner sees a need for another organization. And so in the 1890s, you get the establishment of the Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Society. So Turner establishes this, and of course, there are important women who lead this organization, and it is meant to be more based in the South and in the West. And
Hmm.
specifically, what this women's auxiliary does, in addition to various missionary activities within their areas, they also are supporting financially Bishop Turner's efforts in Africa.
Hmm.
So it is really a counterpoint to the Women's Parent Mite Missionary Society, which was founded in the 1870s in the North. Now you have the Women's Home and Foreign Missionary Society, founded in the 1890s and predominantly in the South and in the West.
What should we know about Emma Tucker, the first president?
Sorry, I forgot that part of your question.
All
Yeah,
right, that's
so
all right.
Emma Tucker, she is the wife of a minister in the IMAC named Charles Tucker, and she is instrumental. She's the first, president of the Women's Home and Foreign in the IMAC. And so she is really remarkable in her efforts, not only to just run the organization and ensure that there is a vibrant membership, but she takes some really interesting steps. So, for example, she halts a meeting one time in August because August is when generally people in the African diaspora celebrate the end of slavery in the British, Caribbean.
Hmm.
And so she halts, their meetings so that they can go to Hartshorn and participate in a celebration of the end of slavery in the British West Indies. So emphasizing that she had a vision of Indian Territory as being a part of this larger diaspora, and she was, very active in trying to make sure everyone was aware of that. In addition to that, she just apparently was quite well organized and ran the organization in a very professional manner. And that was something that her contemporaries remarked on, that am I in Indian Territory or am I in Atlanta? Am I in Philadelphia? Because the way she runs this organization makes me feel like I could be in any major city with these sophisticated people. And so people were quite impressed with her managing of this organization.
Fascinating. Okay, page 28, I'm sorry, page 128 begins your discussion on AME churches established in Indian Territory, first among them being the church founded in Scullyville. Please talk about what it took to establish a new church in Indian Territory.
It was not easy. You had to get the land for it, of course. You have to know that there will be a membership there. And one of the things you see over time is that if, the railroad bypasses the town where your church is, well, then maybe all the people will move somewhere else. Okay, so what do we do with that church? So certainly it's important to have a church planted where the people are, which is, not so different from today. But that was certainly the case in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s when they were establishing churches like the one in Scullyville in the Choctaw Nation. And so you have to secure land, you have to have a devoted membership, and you have to meet the financial obligations and be able to support the people in all the ways that they expect. So it's in a way not terribly different from planting a church anywhere, but keeping in mind that, of course, these are oftentimes rural areas and the people do not have a great deal of money. They are, supporting the pastor, supporting the church as best they can. And as we see over time, as populations migrate, this becomes a challenge to keep those churches going. And sometimes the churches just kind of fold and just move elsewhere where the people are.
Okay. All right. What led to the decline of congregations in the IMAC in the early 1900s? And what role did the railway system play in this? You mentioned specifically the Kansas City Southern Railway on page 134.
Yeah, so it's a bit like I just said, that if a new railroad line comes in and it bypasses where you live and it goes somewhere else, well, the people will tend to move there, leaving a very small membership left in that church. And then the question is, what do we do with it? Do we just let that church falter? Do we just go where the people are now? And so that is the dynamic that we certainly see in this period. Because, of course, by the time we get to the early 1900s, there has been a significant amount of migration of African Americans and whites into Indian Territory. And so, as they are settling in these different areas, the church has to adjust to that. And sometimes, because of these migratory patterns, because of railroads bypassing certain areas, that could have a deleterious effect on existing churches.
Sure. All right. On page 135, you talk about African American population increase in the IMAC. How did residents of Indian Territory feel about the presence of both black and white migrants? Was the presence of black Indians affected by the changing IMAC demography?
This is certainly a complex issue because certainly Black Indigenous people feel a level of, ownership of the lands that they are living on. The fact that they had been enslaved by these various tribes, and now if they're able to acquire land and now they have their churches, they feel, a sense of ownership of that area. And so to have such a steady influx of African Americans, whites, whoever else, that put pressure, of course, on their population. And on the one hand, we see Black Indigenous people marrying African American migrants. We see that, oftentimes. A lot of times you see, AME ministers marrying Black Indigenous women. So that was a common thing to have happen. So on the one hand, they're accepting of these African American migrants coming in. But of course, it must have led to some concern that, are we going to be overrun in our own churches? Are we going to still have, our share of what we have built? And so, you can imagine that there was some tension there, but also you do see examples of Black and Indigenous people worshiping in the same churches with African Americans. And so there is certainly intermixture, but you can imagine that there was probably some tension just because of how significant the influx of people was.
Okay. All right. You ready for your quote?
Yes. This is my favorite part.
All right. It's on page 137, and it's about schools. So, quote, by the 1870s, the AME Church had already established various schools throughout the country, most notably Wilberforce University in Ohio. From their first years in Indian Territory, African Methodists continued in this pattern by founding day schools and colleges, performing a much-needed service to freedmen. So please expand upon the impact of African Methodists and mainly AME ministers on the education of Black Indian children.
You really can't overstate the importance that education held for freed people, African Americans and Black Indigenous people. After the war, after slavery ended, one of the main things that people wanted to do, in addition to, finding their lost family members, was to acquire an education. And as was the case, outside of Indian Territory, just in the American South, schooling was hard. It was hard to have enough funds to have, functioning schools of all levels. You're dealing with people who are at, different educational levels. And so it was a complex process, not to mention the fact that schools were sometimes the target of white vigilante violence, people who did not want to see people of African descent becoming educated. But one of the reasons that I argue in chapter 4, one of the reasons why Black Indigenous people wanted the AME Church to come to Indian Territory was because of the denomination's history of educating people. The fact that the AME Church had really the best educated clergy among, all these denominations. And so when the AME Church does come, almost immediately, they're establishing schools in various forms, whether it's a Sunday school, a day school, and they, certainly go along with the seasons. If, you have a heavy planting season, they would understand, okay, we're not going to have school in those months. But you see really a devotion to education among Black Indigenous people and a real appreciation for it that the AME Church was bringing that to them in various forms. That doesn't mean that all the schools were, you know, perfectly functioning and had everything they needed. Oftentimes they did not, but it was still certainly better than nothing. And the AME Church was trying, in every way it could to provide those services to Black, Indigenous people who were just not getting those services elsewhere.
Amazing work. All right. So, what role did the U.S. government play in providing funds for churches? Pages 138 through 139 detail educational development and subsequent government assistance in white Baptist churches. So, how did Bishop Turner exercise his influence to secure funds for Indian Territory?
Well, see, this is part of why people were so excited when Turner came, because he came not only with his cachet within the Black community, but he had political contacts. He had been a politician. And so he's able to leverage that, the people he knows, his knowledge of the system and how it worked, to get money to help support these schools. And so he's able to successfully do that. It's even remarked upon in IMAC annual conference minutes that Bishop Turner was able to get us $2,000, which was, a good bit of money back then.
Yeah, that was a lot of money.
To help fund our schools. And so this is where Turner is really showing his value in Indian Territory, that he does have those contacts. He does understand how the system works, and he's able to ensure that these schools are able to operate. Now, again, they never have as much as they want. They never have as much as they need. But without Turner, they would have had less.
All right. I want to shift back to schools for a second. So, what was the state of schools set up by African Methodists in Indian Territory? How did they sustain themselves, and where are they now? Specifically, please go into detail about the openings of the Sisson Mission School, which was later renamed Sisson Industrial Institute, and Flipper Key Davis University.
A lot of the day schools and high schools, it's not entirely clear what happened to them. They were, remarked upon in annual conference minutes and general conference minutes and district conference minutes. But in terms of where they are today, that is not entirely clear. But we do know a bit more about Sisson Industrial Institute. So it is named after James Fitzallen Sisson, who we talked about in the previous chapter, in chapter 5, who was this white minister who came to the South after the war and then ends up in Arkansas and then Indian Territory and plays a central role in establishing the IMAC. Well, because of his work, because of his efforts, they named this school, Sisson Industrial Institute, after him. And it has, an industrial campus. It, really is serving as the main institution of higher education for AMEs in this region. Eventually, it acquires the Tallahassee boarding school, and that gives it more land. And it is eventually renamed Flipper Key Davis, and then later Flipper Key Davis Junior College. And so that was in existence up until, I believe, like the Great Depression. And so I was able to acquire sort of a yearbook from the 1920s from Flipper Key Davis. And It gives some of this history, and we can see who some of the students were and who their parents were. And we see among the students and among the parents and faculty, we see AMEs like Pink Thompson and various other people who had close ties to the AME Church.
Oh, wow. All right. Finally, we're going to talk about publications, which you start on page 146. All right. So how did publications and minutes act as a voice for the AME Church? What kinds of information did AMEs convey to publications such as the Christian Recorder? And please also talk about AME correspondence with native papers.
One thing about AMEs, they are going to keep meticulous records.
Amen.
From the beginning of the denomination, AMEs understood that if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. If you don't preserve it, it didn't happen. I mean, Richard Allen, he understood that publishing during his lifetime, uh, publishing disciplines, publishing, his personal thoughts, and having annual conference minutes published every year, having general conference minutes published every 4 years. AMEs understood the importance of telling their own story and keeping their own records. And I'm so grateful they did, because if they hadn't, people could say, oh, they weren't there. Oh, that didn't happen. Well, I have the proof. And so Indian Territory is no exception. So the Indian Mission Annual Conference, we have annual conference minutes from that time. I have the 1882, 1883, 1907. I wish I had more, but I'm grateful that I have those, and they're able to provide a great deal of information. They give us names. I mentioned the dollar money, and dollar money lists are in these annual conference minutes. And in addition, AMEs are constantly writing to the Christian Recorder, and the Christian Recorder is publishing these letters. So Sisson, for example, writes to the Christian Recorder a lot about his experiences in Indian Territory, and that provides some of the basic information that we have about this time period and what is going on. So you have AMEs keeping annual conference minutes, and keeping other records, writing letters, and all those things have survived. Of course, I wish we had everything, but we do have a considerable amount, enough for me to write this book. In terms of native papers, so the 5 civilized tribes are also publishing various newspapers, and AMEs and AME news is making its way into these papers. And there's certainly an implication that AMEs like Dennis Barrows were directly communicating with native editors and telling them about what the church was doing, and then those items were being published. So there is this strong connection, not only with the AME church founding their own resources and producing their own resources, but also publishing in the native newspapers. And you find some surprising tidbits in there. So you see Sisson popping up in indigenous newspapers, you see Dennis Barrows popping up, and so that is a really important resource as well.
I don't mean to go off script, but you also talked about Allen's autobiography. You talk about the history books that have been written. So could you talk about that just for a second?
Yeah, so I mentioned those to help contextualize what the IMAC was doing, what people in the IMAC were doing. It is not an aberration to have people keeping such copious notes and keeping such, diligent records of this time period. That is kind of baked into the cake of African Methodism, keeping these meticulous records, having, for a Black organization to say what we're doing is important and it should be preserved and people should know that we did this. To have Payne say, I'm going to write a history of the denomination because it matters and because these stories matter. I mean, that's, that means something to be able to kind of see that book. I wish I had it with me. It's in my office, and be able to plop that down and say, yeah, we're here. We were here. We've been here since, such and such year. This is what we've accomplished. And that was a powerful statement, not only to the outside world, but to other African Americans, to other Black people, to say that, again, what we're doing matters. And this is what we have accomplished. This isn't just me saying it. These are the records. And so ministers in the IMAC keeping these records, making sure that they were being published in the Christian Recorder and also indigenous newspapers, that's just more of that. That's more of that. That's more of that belief that what the denomination was doing, what the denomination was and what it represented was important.
That's all the questions I had. Any big picture takeaways from chapter 6?
Yeah, so really this is the longest chapter in the book. This is really the infrastructure chapter where I'm really trying to make the point that the AME church isn't just kind of popping in here, popping in there, and maybe they have a church here, but they are establishing a real infrastructure. They've established the conference. They've established these various churches. They're establishing schools. They are publicizing their work. All of that is leading to the denomination having a really steady presence in Indian territory. And that will be very important once we get to the final chapter, chapter 7, where the relationships that the ministers have built and the records they've been able to produce for Black Indigenous people, all of that is going to come into play and be important once Black Indigenous people have to prove who they are and prove their citizenship in order to be fully recognized by the 5 civilized tribes. And so that's the story that the book ends with in chapter 7.
Makes you proud to be an AME. Indeed. All right. Well, thank you so much. That's chapter 6. We have one more chapter, and I look forward to talking about chapter 7. Thank you.
I look forward to it too. Thank you.
All right.